join us. That's great.
Yes, that's right.
Is Stu on or not? Do you know?
No, he hasn't arrived yet.
Okay.
Hello there.
Hi, Paul.
How you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Hi,
Hello,
Bert.
Paul.
How you doing?
Very good, thanks. Good to hear your voice.
Thank you. Good to see you.
What do you say, Carolyn? Shall we start?
Yeah, I guess so.
All right. Well, welcome. Who is here? Everyone to this webinar that's hosted by the Socio-Technical Systems Roundtable on behalf of the Global Network for Smart Organization Design. I think I know most of you or all of you, but my name is Bert Painter. I'm an independent consulting social scientist from British Columbia in Canada, a longtime member of the Roundtable and now involved in the coordination of our global network. I will be co-presenting this webinar with my colleague, Carolyn Ordowich.
Yes, Carolyn from Princeton, New Jersey. I'm sorry my camera's not working today, but I've also been a longtime member of the Roundtable, at least for the last probably 12, 14 years, and a practitioner for 40. So I'm happy to be here and share this with you today.
Okay, our objective for the webinar. Carolyn, you operating the...
Yeah.
So our objective for the webinar is to enrich our socio-technical systems design heritage, hopefully bringing in new ideas, frameworks, or practices for smart organization design in a digital world. And the agenda really has two parts. First, a review of the conceptual foundation of our whole integral system organization design heritage. And over the next 25 minutes or so, Carol and I will present highlights from our point of view about this heritage, and then invite some additional comments from all of you for 10 minutes or so, because for the second half of the webinar, because we have 90 minutes and then we have a second half of 45 minutes, where we want to really devote most of our time to inviting your comment and speculation and how the meaning and characteristics of these design perspectives may have shifted in a digital, hyper-connected, and time-compressed world. The webinar is really the first stage of what we intend to be a crowdsourcing process. Can you go back to the third slide, Carolyn?
Okay.
To elaborate an updated smart organization design framework. And in this webinar, we want to mention to you that the framework and reinvention process will continue beyond this webinar at our upcoming conference in Los Angeles, September 10th to 13th at the University of Southern California. And if you haven't already registered or you'd like to do so, at the bottom of this slide is a link to our website, www.stsroundtable.com, where you can register. At University of Southern California in September, we will apply our learning from our study of some really highly innovative organization design situations, brought to us by people like Bill, who's on this call, and Stu Winby, hopefully will join us, to refine this evolving design framework. And then, over the next year, in 2020, we want to continue our learning within a social media platform like Slack, perhaps, to exchange ideas with a broader community of people in organizational design. So with that as the background, we've got a two-part agenda. Let's jump into a review of our heritage. And our heritage is based initially in the work of social scientists at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, England, who were very engaged in industry and society in support of economic recovery from the outcomes of World War II. This heritage can be said to span two basic time frames. The first was covering a pioneering phase that started in 1949, very shortly after the Institute was founded, in work that was done in British coal mines and Indian textile mills, and then later in the 1960s in heavy industry, particularly in Norway. And what emerged is what has been described as a basic shift in organizational paradigm. A departure from the emphasis in previous paradigms on either the technical, for example, in the work of scientific management developed by Taylor, or the social in the human relations school developed by Elton Mayo and others in the United States. In the Tavistock approach, both factors, the technical and the social, were integrated as components of one single socio-technical systems entity. And then the second part of our heritage, during the last quarter of the 20th century, modern socio-technical design evolved with amendments and different development trajectories in places like Australia, the Netherlands, Sweden, and indeed North America. Language and concepts, and particularly methodologies, differed in these schools, yet they're all rooted in the Tavistock tradition, with a focus on achieving organizational excellence in both technical performance and the human quality of people's lives. Now, the Tavistock tradition evolved, and you can move on, Carolyn, and was strongly influenced through three distinct perspectives or ways of knowing and engaging with the world. Initially, and particularly immediately after the Second World War, the formulation of concepts were conducted through the lens of a socio-psychological perspective that had a psychoanalytic orientation and built on the work of Bion and Lewin in the study of groups. And soon thereafter, the centrality of the work group was combined with Trist's knowledge of Lewis Mumford's work on techniques and civilization, linking the technical and the social. And then with Emery, who brought von Bertalanffy's work on open systems theory to develop the socio-technical systems perspective. And eventually, the Tavistock researchers needed to extend their systems framework to create a third perspective, the socio-ecological, that focuses on systems and their environments. These three perspectives, in our minds, constitute the conceptual foundation of the new organizational paradigm, socio-technical systems design, linking the individual to the group to the organization, and the organization to the environment. The three perspectives are interdependent, as indicated by the Venn diagram. Yet each has its own focus or lens. And individually, indeed, these perspectives have been widely adopted individually in the last 50 years as methodologies by many disciplines. However, what we believe is unique about our socio-technical systems design heritage is that the three perspectives are integrated into one whole view of organization design, knitted together by a participative design process. And I'll turn it over to Carolyn to talk more about that design process and the methodology that gave rise to the discovery of these perspectives.
Thanks, Bert. So as you see, the integral system participative design process is right in the middle of this diagram as the sweet spot. That's sort of the golden thread that weaves the three perspectives together uniquely according to the context of the whole system being designed. So deliberately, there's no cookie cutter recipe for this, even though I know early in my career, I was desperate to know, how do you actually do this? And for that, I had to thank Lou Davis for the short course and Bill Passmore for the 9-step model, and my own mentors, Bill Wesley and Albert Churns, who kept me grounded in the philosophy. But deliberately action research is really bringing out the values in the process. And we've highlighted the word direct participation, because underlying that are some very important values that we still are all connected by, I think, for those of us who practice socio-technical systems theory. And that is a profound respect for human dignity, that there's no domination of one person over the other, the researcher over participant in a company or organization. There's autonomy within a coherent whole, that each person has agency to shape the future of the design they're working on, but also that it be within the collective so that it can be implemented. There's the value of reciprocity and mutual benefit. Like in nature's symbiosis, we want not just one party to benefit or one party to benefit, the other party to be harmed, but that there be mutual benefit in the design to all the stakeholders or constituents that are involved. And lastly, the whole notion of wholeness, of seeing the system and environment and understanding the direct and unintended consequences of our interactions before we act on them, so we truly can produce that mutual reciprocity. So that those values were embedded in the action research and really weren't codified in a methodology. They were tacitly present. And only later did they become participative democracy explicitly as a normative worldview. And then as these ideas spread further, what we started to see, especially after World War II and all the examples Bill gave, a number of schools of STS design started to emerge, and with different methodologies and different ways of using these lenses, but always based on those values that I just talked about. And I think probably too, one of the reasons we didn't bring out the democracy as early on was that it was still a fragile concept right after World War II, so very contextual. But if you look today, almost everyone's practice has some of that participative design in it, but again, it matches the cultural context, whether it's Australian, North American, European, and also matches the client context, whether it's in routine industries, non-routine industry. And our view here is that the participative design, really as a conceptual foundation, easily gets lost in these different versions, and we can easily drift into competition of models and methods. And this is why we wanted to bring this back to the forefront, because it's deliberately not codified because of the nature of it needing to match the environment. But we need to bring our framework back to the forefront so that we can all collaborate to improve it and create new methodologies that each of us can use in new ways. So the participative design conceptual foundation, as Bert has said, we think is really unique in that it integrates the meta, macro, and micro levels of social systems into a whole integral design, using a process of design that has the same features as the desired final state, such as giving people the experience of participation and self-regulation as they design. So we are a community who share these values, share these perspectives, and now we hope to work with you to look at these perspectives in more detail. I can get my, there we go. Looking at the whole integral system, organization design through the three integrated perspectives. And some of you may have read our heritage paper and how we brought all the history together. Well, what we've done is we've tried to take the essence of this and put it into each perspective that we'd like to share with you and also have your comments on. So looking at the socio-psychological perspective, we think what this perspective is really about is what individuals need for agency to thrive as a group, with culture as the bridge in the dynamic relations between the individual and society. So the socio-psychological perspective is really about the people-to-people interdependencies, the alignment of the identities between micro, macro, meta levels, social levels, into a whole. And while respecting at the same time that mentally healthy people need to have a relative balance between the autonomy or agency, which asserts their individuality, but at the same time balancing it with the community that they live in, which expresses their need to participate in or belong to something larger than themselves. So that agency and culture is that kind of balancing act. We know from our work the 6 psychological criteria of optimal autonomy, continuous learning, variety, also the mutual support, and meaningfulness and desirable future that we need to provide as the context for agency, and that the culture needs to provide as agency. And also, we understand how culture itself, and Marilyn Emery has particularly described this quite well in terms of using ASH's 4 conditions for influential communication or participation, is that the culture itself must maximize openness in all aspects of design, including the design process, which means exposing the underlying assumptions of strategy and long-term goals, as well as individual aspirations. Everything created by the design participants needs to be always visible to them and their constituents all the time to develop the trust by all in the process of transformation. Another condition is the basic humanity or psychological similarity needs to be brought out through a desirable future that reveals the set of ideals that says we're all human with the same concerns, because this sets the foundation for the possibility of more creative cooperative work towards common purpose. And the third condition is really understanding the same worldview of our environment, the emergence of what she called a mutually shared field. And this is based on the shared understanding of the environment in which the system to be designed is embedded. Everybody perceives the same changes in the world around them and co-creates the same meaning out of that data. So they co-create a big picture that's common to them all that they can use to test their proposals or plans for redesign or design. And this all becomes these 3 elements of participation fuse into a trust that really helps individuals become open systems. The trust accumulates over time as the individual comes to experience the openness of the world he or she shares with others, and the mutual respect and consideration that is accruing from initiating greater depth in communications with others that strengthens and deepens the interpersonal relations and increases then the probability of mutual learning and adaptation, so that individuals put away their masks of passivity and dissociation. This is what then is the culture that releases the energy of individuals and intensifies the interpersonal engagement together to create a new world, a better world. So the culture is something that is a process of mediating the individual's relationships with other members and other groups in his or her system so that they can act together. That's what we think the socio-psychological perspective is. Now I'm going to let Bert do the socio-technical.
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, this is a perspective that probably we're most familiar with. And to capture the essence of it, the words that we're choosing to use are the following: that this is about organizing for work, in other words, value creation, essentially through the design of structures and processes that jointly optimizes both the social and technical aspects in an integrated system. Historically, and I'll just try to highlight some of the concepts behind this perspective that, again, have given it life as our heritage has developed. Initially, this concept of a socio-technical system arose in conjunction with the fairly well-known field projects undertaken by Tavistock in the coal mining industry in Britain between 1949 and the late 50s. What was essentially discovered in the coal mining work was that the technological imperative could be disobeyed with both positive and economic and human results. Under the old paradigm, basically the technological imperative suggested that the design of the organization would be based upon what the technology required. Now Ken Bamforth, a miner, and Eric Trist, a social scientist, in the study of two very different ways of organizing work in coal mining using the same electric or pneumatic coal face undercutting technology, discovered that there is in fact organizational choice in how to organize with any given technology for positive economic and human results. And another key tenet, along with organizational choice, that came out of the coal mining studies was the organizational foundation in the multi-skilled primary work group that self-regulates a whole task system. Indeed, in the comparison of the initial two mining operation that Bamforth and Trist studied, it was the one based upon the primary multi-skilled work group that produced better economic productivity and better human results in terms of lower absenteeism and fewer safety incidents. Indeed, the multi-skilled primary work group and what got popularized as teams was also promoted in the work of David Herbst, a Norwegian colleague at Tavistock, and Ken Rice, of course, in his work in the textile mills in India. And later, in the development of the Dutch socio-technical approach, Ubel de Sitter also embraced the importance of the multi-skilled work group that could self-regulate. Another important concept from the very beginning has been the concept of systems. Systems in terms of the interdependencies of the social and technical, and in terms of open systems theory, in as much as socio-technical concepts are concerned with the environment in which an organization does regular commerce in input and output exchanges of materials and products. Now, in conjunction with the Norwegian Industrial Democracy Project that was led by Einar Thorsrud and Fred Emery in the early 60s in Norway, Emery reformulated this matching of the technological component and the social or work relationship structure as what is popularly known as the joint optimization of social and technical systems. And this is where we start to see some of the amendments that were developed in the modern period beyond the 1970s as different schools developed in socio-technical systems thinking, particularly in the Dutch variant of modern socio-technical theory. The original socio-technical ideal of integrating social and technical aspects remains in the Dutch model, but with different concepts of organization structure. For example, the Dutch substituted the definition of work organization as the interdependent set of technical and social subsystems with the concept of an organization as an interacting network of people as the primary elements that executed tasks and roles using technological instrumentation, tools, and machines as attributes. So there are differences in terms of how some of these concepts got interpreted by schools as the modern period developed. But one concept in which the Dutch and the Tavistock schools are very close is the Dutch concept of control capacity and the ability of people to exercise discretion to control interferences or what we might call variances in work processes. So very similar to the Tavistock concept of responsible autonomy and variance control. And the elaboration of this link between the character of work processes and their psychological effects has remained a key feature of the classical and modern periods of socio-technical systems design. In fact, Emery and Thorsrud, during their work in Norway, first wrote about a limited number of general psychological requirements of work. All the time, of course, Thorsrud and Emery were very much concentrated on the democratization of work on the shop floor in Norway. But in his later work in Australia, Emery came to refine these notions of psychological requirements into 6 psychological requirements for jobs in a work organization. Interestingly, at the same time that Emery returned to Australia at the end of the 60s and early 70s, an American mechanical engineer and professor of management who had been a colleague of Emery and Thorsrud in Norway, Lou Davis, whom Carolyn mentioned and has been a part of each of our lives, returned to North America and founded a program at UCLA that focused on the quality of working life, based on the principles and enabled by the principles of socio-technical systems design. Now, what was particularly unique about Davis was a way of thinking that he brought forward, which was based upon an understanding of the technology effects on jobs. And Davis, as an engineer, was very qualified to assert that there are indeed psychosocial assumptions built into production technology. Davis and his student, Eli Bernecker, went on to advocate for the concept of technological choice as part of this socio-technical systems perspective. That being the belief that at least 2 alternative ways of doing something must be provided by technology designers. And with automated process technology, technological choice in Davis's view became even more imperative because new technology possesses unrecognized flexibility and because, ironically, the technology increases the dependence of the organizations on more commitment and greater perceptual decision-making skills of people. Indeed, this application of microelectronics and factory and office systems in the latter quarter of the 20th century was a key part of transforming the workforce into knowledge workers. And this had an impact on the reshaping of the socio-technical systems heritage at the same time. The work of knowledge workers was non-routine, unprogrammed tasks in work systems that were described as nonlinear. And this area of knowledge work provoked a call for renewal of STS perspectives, renewal called for by people like Bill Passmore, Enid Mumford, and particularly in the words of Cal Pava, a student of Eric Triss at the Wharton School, who wrote that to make it more suitable for non-routine, non-linear work systems, STS design must itself be redesigned. So that's a very quick sort of background to some of the highlights of this very rich socio-technical systems perspective, which, as I said, in the Tavistock work, evolved to a third perspective.
The socio-ecological perspective is about understanding both the unity of the organization and its environment, so that we understand the respective underlying dynamics in that environment, enabling us to design strategies, relationships, and processes for future opportunity. And I think it's really important here to understand the 4 what they call different processes that identify L11 is the organization itself and its area of internal interdependencies, from L22, which is what really makes this an open system, is its extended social field, where it has its own interdependencies within the environment itself, interdependencies that are socioeconomic, sociopolitical, etc. So what we're trying to understand is how the organization deals with its interdependencies, as Bert just described in terms of the socio-tech, but we also need to understand how that organization is interdependent with the environment, so that it has these transactional interdependencies. L12 are between the organization and the environment, normally known as planning. That is, it's the output to the environment, how it's going to respond to the environment. And L21 is the transactional interdependency between the organization and the environment, normally known as adaptive learning. That is the input back to the organization about the response that it made. So what Emery and Trist wrote was a paper about causal texture. This field, the extended social field, L22, had different kinds of texture. They were either placid randomized, placid clustered, disturbed reactive, or what we're living today, the turbulent field. And what's important was understanding how each texture, causal texture, required a different organizational response. So it's understanding the dynamics and the response that made this a much more complex understanding of what an open system does. So for designers, this means situating any organizational design challenge or problem within a larger socio-ecology, so that you can understand that extended social field, understand the socio-political, socio-economic dynamics that influence a particular organization and their responses. The Emorys, both Fred and Marilyn together, developed the socio-ecological perspective into a OST methodology that basically includes sociotech and socio-psychological systems perspectives. But it's really moving the unit of analysis up to the socio-ecological level in terms of calling it the system in environment, and developing the methodology to look at that. And in discussing and learning with Bert about how this might move into the digital era, we recognize we're probably in the most turbulent time, and that this system in the environment really becomes something that we need to look at and design for much differently than we have in the past. So what you see here is our interpretation of the three perspectives. And what we wanted to do now is to move into inviting you to comment on whether, you know, we're pulling out the right essence from each of these perspectives. Does it make sense to you to look at these three perspectives? And I am going to, if I can figure out how to do this, try to take notes on this as we go through it. So,
have you got that diagram again? Have we lost the
you want to go back to the previous one? Yes. No, I can't hold this on the screen and write at the same time. So maybe I'll just take notes and we'll see how we can do it later then, Bert.
Okay.
Carolyn, you just need to share again, but you will need to go back to the PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, but then we can't see the meanings of them.
The meanings. No, I could share the meanings if you want.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So
let me get the meanings for you. And I'm going to unmute people so they can participate. Let me share first.
We wanted to allow something of the order of 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes for the rest of you to add your voice to what we've described as the heritage. Perhaps challenge some of what we've said or add to it in terms of the depiction that we've given to the heritage. And for those of you that don't get a chance to fully speak your mind in 10, 15 minutes or so, we will also indicate at the end of the webinar a way for you to add your comments. But our hope is that we also leave the latter 45 minutes to project these perspectives into the digital world. That's where we want to put the remainder of the use of our time. But for the next 10, 15 minutes, what are your comments, thoughts regarding the way we have described our heritage, and anything that you'd want to add or highlight that perhaps we omitted? Hello? Hello, Joe. We have
just and this just hit me. I know these are the three perspectives that we usually have, but I wonder if choosing not to have the technological perspective as a separate one loses something. I've never thought that before, but it's interesting that we combine it with the social, but we don't have it separate. We talked about it as the perspective leading into the coal mining experiments and that type of stuff, Taylorism, whatever. But there's just so many people that believe still that these three things are held within some technical perspective that not including it may lose something. Just a thought.
Stu, did you want to add something?
Say that again.
Did you want to add something, Stu? I wasn't sure if...
No, I had a distraction here. I'm sorry.
Okay. Bernard, did you want to add something?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is I have to at least make the case that the socio-technical systems perspective, which I learned, which came out of Lou Davis and the group in California more than 45 years ago, I think incorporated much of the socio-psychological and the socio-ecological. But we have, I think, recent, as you said, Bert, the sociotech perspective, was an open systems perspective. It was a perspective that incorporated individual needs and the relationships within the group and so on. What I think has been happening recently that I'm excited about is the evolution of the ecological perspective, which I think, we had traditionally seen as the environment within the organization, but we looked at it from a transactional perspective and looked at it from more a demand orientation when it really is a demand and opportunity system that the organization is exchanging with. And I think we're looking, with the ecological perspective or the ecosystem perspective, that would be my preferred term. I think we're looking much more at the relationships that exist within the ecosystem and that set of relationships and the organization. So it's not so much a one-to-one as a many-to-one or a one-to-many, I think, perspective that's very useful. And that's an exciting evolution for me. To Joe's thought about the missing piece about technology. I've never equated technology with the technical system. That's, I think, one difference Joe and I may have. But I do think the point about the pervasiveness of digital technology in particular is not easily visible, I think, in these three perspectives. And somehow, I don't know how, it feels like we should highlight it or elevate it somehow.
Okay, interesting. Okay. Who wants to jump in next?
I would like to make some comments, Bert.
Go ahead, Don.
First, I think you've nailed it. This was really a good presentation. I like the depth of your...
Whoops. Did we lose Don?
I think so.
He's muted. He's not muted.
Am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Yeah, go back to the beginning if you would, Don. We lost you pretty much.
I was just complimenting you and Carolyn on the depth of your study and presentation. I thought it was very good, and I think you've nailed it. The second comment is, building on what Bernard said, Emery and Trist identified in their 65 causal texture paper that single organizations could not survive in hyperturbulent environments.
Right.
And so the need to develop ecosystem perspectives that include the socio-ecological, socio-technical, and socio-psychological perspective is big today. And I hope that as we move forward, we can see more and more of the ecosystem perspective. What
Right.
Marilyn Emery's doing with ecosystems is interesting. As we know from Peter Otten, she defines an ecosystem as a community of organizations or a community of systems. And that's very exciting for me.
Right. So, yeah. And I think, Don, as we go further in this webinar, I think that's one of the things that we want to discuss is how that perspective has perhaps shifted in this period that we're in now. We were trying to capture more the historical sort of depiction of that perspective. Okay. Anybody else want to jump in? We've got a few minutes before we do make this shift, try to make this shift into the digital era.
Bert, this is Paul.
Yeah.
I sort of agree with a number of things that have already been said. I agree with Bernard when he says, I think we've always had all three of these, and I really like calling them out in the model. I also like the technical in the middle, whether that was intentional or not, because I think that was always the focus, right? And we always paid attention to the psychological, those of us that come from a group dynamics background especially, and a little bit the ecological. So it was always there. I think it's a question of what was center and what was dominant, right? And I think the way you represented it in the center was always the social and the technical. I really, Bernard, what you said resonates because I think we always looked at the ecological, but more as an input, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not as a transactional, as an interdependent. How could we co-create, co-design the ecology as well as the system, and what are the implications both ways? So I think what's shifted is the interdependency between the ecosystem and the system is growing, and technology is bringing these things closer together. And the speed with which things are happening are forcing the ecosystem to be more the unit of analysis, which I think, Carolyn, is what you said, is we're sort of moving up, right? And that really resonates with me. I think that's really true. It also strikes me that for people who are new to this, it seems overwhelmingly complex, right? How do we deal with all three of these things simultaneously and synchronously, and where do we put our energy and where do we put our focus? It's pretty, people can handle one of these three. I'm not sure they can handle all three.
Yeah,
and
that's a very, very interesting point. I hold that because I think we might need to build on that as we think forward.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
That's great. Any other insight or comments you want to make on the heritage, the way we've depicted sort of where we've come from before we start to speculate about where we might be going?
I did have a question. I understand it's about the use of the prefix socio in front of each of these. So I understand that the first column represents the individual and the group interface, and so the socio-psychological makes sense. In the second column, I understand that the socio system, the social system, which I understand is really the management system, the coordination system, and so on. And then the work system, as represented by the technical system or the workflow, those two terms make sense. I don't understand the prefix socio in front of the ecological perspective, and I'm wondering what you think Emery and Trist meant by that.
Well, Carolyn, do you want to offer your comment on that?
Well, I think, Bernard, that's where the notion of this social extended field, that there's a social entity there that has its own interdependency that defines the nature of the open system, and that without that understanding, it's not open, it's closed, it's all focused on the organization itself. So, and the other interactions are these other dimensions of socio-economic, socio-political. There are different kinds of interactions that are going on that we need to understand. Sort of like, we're not looking just at a map with roads on it. We're looking at topography map where you can see the rivers and lakes and mountains. So we need to see how all these different social facets are operating in this extended environment to understand our responses to it. That's the best I can do right now.
Yeah. The way I would answer your question, Bernard, or try to answer it, is that in my sense of the ecological perspective, it contains a very diverse number of organizational entities.
Right.
And I think that's where, I mean, the understanding is, as someone said, that that was built into the initial development of the socio-ecological perspective, that no individual organization could manage its own stability in this kind of turbulent field. It's partly a function of all the activity that other organizational entities are undertaking within that ecology. In fact, I mean, we didn't go into all the details of these various perspectives, but in the paper, for example, we mentioned the work of the Turkish student, I think of Tristan, maybe Akov, who developed the Type 5 vortical environment, which was based upon the premise that these organizational entities in the ecology became so large that they would create motion in the field itself, in the environment itself, like you know, a parade of big military vehicles crossing a bridge and the bridge shaking because of the weight and size of these individual vehicles. So that for me is where the social element comes from a lot in the notion of the socio-ecological perspective. It's a reminder that there's a whole lot of other organizational entities out there that have an impact upon, and then of course Trist developed the concept of organizational domains, which were composed of multiple organizations, right, in the ecology. Anybody else before we shift gears here?
So Bert, it's Bill. I also like what you've done in terms of capturing the heritage. I think it's true to what we know our history to be. As I look at it, I'm reminded that all this began because of some people that had some pretty deep concerns about values and what was happening in the workplace and to people. And you know, the socio-psychological perspective was a lot about what we need and value for our work experiences, what people are after. The threat to that was the technology, so we had to get our arms around that in order to create a work system that delivered more of what people needed at work to flourish and grow. And you know, then the recognition was that you can't just operate as if there is no competition or change in technology or things going on in the world around you that affect all of that for survival. So you need to get more capable of understanding that environment and designing for it. And I think this was a pretty natural progression from just being concerned about the coal miner and their experience to the system and the technology, and then to the larger ecology that is a design input as we think about it. All of this is changing as we move towards the future, but there's still an interest in creating good experiences for human beings at work, whatever those might be and whatever people in the future might value.
Yeah, Bill, just if I could, I'd like to ask you a question, because as Carolyn and I were working on this and building off a little bit of what Paul said, we were reminded of the article that you wrote, I think it was in 1995, just after Trist's initial, I think second volume had come out. And because it was just such a rich heritage we have with these multiple perspectives, and as Paul said, it adds a degree of complexity the way to our view, but it is so rich and multidimensional.
Taking up a lot of space, or we got a corrupted file on there.
Yes. So I think that's right. What's the question?
Well, yeah, I'm just wondering, did it remind you of the sort of experience you had when you first were confronted with the writings of Trist and his anthology?
Yes, of course. I mean, the idea that you know, somebody would be able to understand the breadth of all of this was pretty incredible. And you know, I give a lot of credit to Emery for that. He was the theorist of the pair, and Trist would tell you that. And you know, Trist was the practical translator of the Emery mind that
right,
tended to wander into spaces that we wouldn't even begin to consider, and so much of what they created was incredibly rich and systemic in its thinking.
Yeah. Maybe Helen and them, or maybe we should move on because we're getting short of time here. If you're going to, and those of you who haven't spoken up, maybe can capture your thoughts in the digital arena. But Helen, did you want to add something?
No, not anything new from what others have said. The triple perspective that you've presented on the screen is familiar and I think laid out more cleanly, and I like that. Okay.
All right. Well, Carolyn.
Yes. Now we enter the digital world.
Yeah.
Hyper-connected and time compressed, which we're all living and feeling every day. And Joe, to your point about technologies, is that here, when people or companies first try to explore the potential of new technology, and that's what we're doing in a lot of areas right now, whether it's AI or machine learning and robots, they tend to think within the current frameworks. For example, even though I have a car with lots of computer functionality, I still drive it without using a lot of that functionality because it takes learning, and I just don't have the time to sit down and figure it all out. To some people, like my husband, it comes intuitively. To me, it doesn't, and I would really have to pay attention and learn how to do that. So we're doing that with a lot of the technologies today. And by just treating it as something that is, you know, an addition to what we already have, we often miss the deep implications, which in terms of the computerization of my car, we should have realized that cars are becoming semi-autonomous and not too far off in the future, fully autonomous. And the questions of how does that change me as the driver? How does our society's values about driving change? For example, you see now that young people today are less interested in buying cars or in cars in general. Our driving infrastructure we need to change. So these are the deep implications we need to think about in strategic design that some are doing, and I think Bill and Stu probably have, working with some of the leading edge companies, can tell us in September how they're doing that. But for most, they're still sticking with the, you know, what can I just do with this new technology to improve what I'm already doing, and not really questioning what I'm doing in the first place. So what we feel is the most significant effect of data-driven technological progress has been the transformation of the system of value creation itself. And this transformation isn't something that will fix what's broken in our current system. It won't improve things we dislike about current products or services. It's changing how we conceive of the value in the first place. It's a system level transformation that we are now designing for, where sets of linkages connect data to insights and insights to outcomes. And we now have data both at the individual level and the population level. And that kind of insight is really more difficult to copy than a particular technology. So this puts all the emphasis in the organization to compete is to learn. And so learning is also accelerated by this hyperconnectivity and speed of computing. So let's look at this new digital world, socioeconomic technical context for value creation with data. Let's look at something we all do every day, which is brush our teeth. We use a toothbrush for a couple of months and throw it out and buy a new one at a very low cost. It's a commodity product, same for the toothpaste. We go to the dentist, a skilled professional, for an assessment and interventions to keep our teeth healthy. So here we have a service and we have products for dental care. But now look on the far right at the brush monster, the SmarT toothbrush and app. And think about—
Sorry, Carolyn.
Yeah?
I don't think we have your slides.
Really?
Do we, Marcella?
I do.
Oh, you do? Okay, go ahead.
Yes,
Sorry.
yes, I'm running them.
Oh, you're running them. Okay, because I thought I was sharing them, Martel. Okay.
As you wish, you could share if you want. I can stop sharing and then you take control over.
Let's not get into the technical difficulties. Okay. So if you imagine now that this toothbrush is able to analyze your teeth, do some diagnostics, provide you feedback about your brushing behavior, and even alert your dentist to when it sees a cavity. Now there's a whole new realm of value creation and different forms of revenue and the variety of roles that can be included in this dental ecosystem to carry this out. Your toothbrush may be free to the consumer, who pays for 10 cents per minute of brushing to maybe the dentist. Or the toothbrush could be paid for by the dental insurer, or paid for by the dentist as part of an overall dental health system. Or you could have pay for performance toothbrush, where the toothbrush is getting a fee per week or month that tells me that my teeth are healthy. So now we have information about the performance, the usefulness, and the value that the customer derives out of a product or service to provide new opportunities to deliver value within the dental ecosystem. So everything that's a service and a product today is moving into this new value creation opportunity mode. And so what we want to know, next slide, Marcel, is how does this SmarT organization design framework in a digital, hyper-connected, and time-compressed world change the way our lenses work? And what we think is all this connectivity, analytics, data and analytics, give us, open up the aperture of our lenses to see more deeply and broadly. And we still think, and I know it is a complex model, or framework, but it does capture all these different elements that are going on in this new value creation mode. And we think our conceptual foundation is unique in that it integrates the meta, macro, micro levels of social systems into a whole integral design that, especially in a hyper-connected world that values experience over individual product and service, is actually creating that experience at a meta, macro, micro level. And the compressed time means generating futures in the present, which means co-creating this minimal viable product with customers and iterating it until it achieves the value that they're looking for. And so throughout each of these perspectives, there's a balancing of social order and social innovation throughout the three perspectives at the same time. It's almost like a fault line running through here of we need some kind of equilibrium or order at the same time that we need to be continuously changing. And we think that with the framework, that helps us understand how we look at that divergence and convergence within each perspective and knit it together through a design process. So now we're back to you and the next 30 minutes to ask for your insights about how you think our lenses have changed in terms of this new context.
Yeah, and how about if we were to start with the socio-ecological perspective? Because as Bernard and others have said, this has become increasingly an important part of the way we see and act and engage in the world. What about the socio-ecological perspective? If any thoughts about how that may have shifted in the digital world, its meaning or its essence may have shifted. Anyone?
Can you hear me, Bert?
Now I can, Bill. Sorry,
okay,
yes.
Thanks. Well, just a couple of observations about it. The technology that we have now allows us to connect with the ecosystem more completely and in real time than we used to be able to do in the past. So the whole notion of what does it mean to connect to the ecosystem has changed. as a result of the technology and the network platforms that exist. So the connection is possible and tighter where we want it to be if we get agreement from our partners in the ecosystem to do that with us. The other thing is that it's changing faster, so it's more unstable than I think Emory and Trust ever imagined it would become. And the third point I would make is that we also have more ability to influence it and change it, as opposed to it being something that exists exclusively beyond our reach and influences us, but we have no input or control over it. We now have an ability to create and influence the ecosystem by virtue of taking an active role in creating partnerships and communities and constructing things that don't exist today for our benefit, if we find those things to be desirable, using the technologies that we've developed over the years to do that, whether it's search conferences or other vehicles to bring people together who have a shared purpose and a shared value set or a shared interest. So the ecological perspective has become a matter of design as opposed to simply a matter of an input to design.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yes, that's very important, I think, yeah. Anybody else want to comment on the socio-ecological?
I just think with the amount of data that exists, only a fraction of it's really used, but it's there and it's changing the way we measure things all the time. So I'm wondering if people's definitions are, that if we don't keep up with those real time, how do we really design effectively? Because we don't know what's good enough anymore. So the turbulence actually acts on itself and it creates a complexity that is, when you said the vertical, the waves that happen with that environment, it's what we're living in now, but I don't know how we keep an accurate temperature when our definition of temperature is changed.
Yeah, to combine that with what Bill's saying is interesting in terms of the effect on design. Anybody else?
Yeah, Bert, can you hear me at all?
Yeah, sure can.
Oh, okay. Well, I think a couple things have happened. One, and I've mentioned this before, is that what digital technology has done is it's decentralized information processing. In other words, organizations have been designed to process information. If we look at Jay Galbraith's work, you organize around information processing to be able to make that more efficient, more effective. And what digital technology has done is decentralized and pushed information technology, information processing down to lower levels of the organization. So power has shifted and information has shifted and problem solving has shifted to the people that are creating the value. And now what's happened is that digital technology has become much more user focused. So you're getting data now from customers and members of the ecosystem. And that data, rather than going directly to the middle part of the organization that used to process information, it's now going to the people who are actually creating the value. So the value creation, or the individuals who are doing the work, are now linked to customers and members of the ecosystem. And that relationship is changing the way that jobs are designed, as well as the way performance is managed. So I think Carolyn or someone mentioned that, we focus on all the aspects of performance like we always have around quality and timeliness and productivity and those kind of issues, but experience, the customer experience now has become increasingly more important. And there's a system now that can be set up, i.e. a work system between customers and members of the ecosystem and members who make decisions and getting feedback loops and getting data and then changing the customer experience real time. So I think from a strategic organization design perspective, you're seeing more organizations getting organized around customer segments than you are around product structures. Now that's a generalization, but I think that's the way that we're headed. The other spin on this that we're learning in the work that Bill and I and a few others are doing is that these modular platforms, these platforms are becoming more modularized from an organizational perspective. So they're not only IT platforms, but they're actually, what's emerging is platforms that are modular platforms or kind of social technical platforms that are organized around customer sets, and they're actually and run by product managers and product teams. So I guess, you know, a way to kind of summarize all this is that it seems like social technical design, we're going full circle, where the environment and the technology is sort of begging the theory and solution of social technical design in terms of more self-managing structures, much more decentralized information processing and decision making, and of course, you know, the changing of jobs and more discretion or different types of discretion with people who are creating the value. So anyway, that's just one point of view.
Yeah, and that has all what you're saying, Stu, has real implications as well for the socio-technical systems perspective. I think because we used to think that work systems were contained within the organization, and what you're saying is really they're all very much connected with the ecology of organizations now.
They are, and I think and this is going to require a lot more conversation and thought, but I think also what's happening is that the IT structure is pushing towards these platform models. The platform models have generally been associated with, you know, different business models like Uber and Airbnb and places like that. But the platform model in Google, for example, is now becoming an internal process. So in other words, rather than thinking of a platform structure as being something that aligns the ecosystem and the and customers around the business model, which it does, what's also happening is that internally that platform IT structure is an organizing principle within the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So you might have Google that has 300 platforms, and those platforms are each organized around a common set of customers or a common mission. And then the linkages is between that output customer base and the internal platform, which is a social technical, you know, you organize that as a social technical system. So that shift now is beginning to take place. So if you look at that, if you explain that from a social technical perspective, it makes a lot of sense in terms of how that is evolving.
Before we move to the socio-technical systems perspective, in fact, any other thoughts about the socio-ecological? Because we do think, Carolyn and I do think, yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Oh, no, sorry. I mean, I just have a couple of adds. The first is, Bill and Stu, when I listen to you, it's really interesting, the languaging, because Bill, you use the word technology, but you didn't use digital. Others use digital, but don't use technology. Stu, you use digital technology. And, you know, and it's sort of curious to me about what are we talking about? Is digital a technology? Just one of a million between robotics and artificial intelligence and all these other things. And so are we talking about something even, I don't know, I mean, I'm going to say bigger than digital, which is technology, because I think, Bill, you said technology is enabling us to connect, right? And I think that's really true. Whether it's, Carolyn, your example of connect me to my dentist when I brush my teeth, right, to connecting people. And that's my first one. Second is, I think the other thing that's happening is technology is enabling us to see things that are in plain sight that we weren't necessarily able to see before. Right? It uncovers whether it's data analytics, whatever. I think we have better resolution, visible resolution into what's really going on, which both helps and maybe complicates things in some way. And then my last point was, I think this whole technology is having an impact on what is and what's the meaning of work, right? And I think it's a part of the social, ecological, societal point of view that says that what people look for in work has very little to do, or maybe less to do, with what the organization's product or service delivery value creation process is, and more about the footprint that it leaves, the impact that it has, and things like that. And so, the meaning of work is shifting, I think, as a result of technology and the technological implications. So, my last thought.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we've spent about 10 minutes on the sociological, and part of what you're saying, Paul, really, and the focus on technology really does connect very much with the essence of the socio-technical systems perspective. And just as maybe building on what you're saying, and as a bit of a trigger for this, and looking at how that perspective, the socio-technical systems perspective, has itself perhaps shifted in this digital world. I would offer up the view that the relationship between the socio and the technical has in fact become even closer than it used to be. There's a kind of a symbiosis now. And perhaps one of the ways of illustrating this is the way in which through robotics and artificial intelligence, in fact, technology has become an actor alongside human beings. So I think the socio-technical interface is different now. And as you say, Paul, it may very well be part of changing what the meaning of work is for us as human beings, now that we're now acting in concert with technology as partners in a different kind of way than we did with machinery. And I think there's some other aspects of how this perspective of socio-technical systems, which used to be the sort of the structure and processes of value creation, I think there's some differences now in the meaning of that perspective in the digital world as well, other ways. So any other thoughts about how the socio-technical systems perspective, kind of the heart of a lot of this design, may itself have changed as well? I think we've touched on it a little bit by comments about the socio-ecological.
Yeah, can you hear me, Bert?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I would, one thing that seemingly is added, if you look at joint optimization and you think about it from the variance point of view that you were mentioning, variance control, by linking customers and involving members of the ecosystem, you also start doing ideation. So what you're doing is you're getting people not only controlling the variances, but also thinking of what things could be, how you could change, thinking out of the box, thinking of coming up with new ideas and testing those ideas. And that's and getting people engaged in doing that process. So it's the relationship between the social and technical now has changed the relationship where people are engaged in not only variance control, but also in ideation.
Right. Yeah, it creates a whole new dynamic. Other thoughts?
Just there's an interesting link with the ideation. Coca-Cola's new vending machine, or the dispensing machine, the Freestyle, they get all kinds of trajectory on what's the volume of flow and what flavors are being used, and And that started out as just a logistical issue. They wanted to get the packages smaller so it would cost less to ship it. Now they're changing flavors of Diet Coke based on the mixtures customers are making.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to point out something about this is Steve Alter, about where we've gone. It seemed like we started by talking about organization design, and then these different frameworks, different viewpoints, and then we got to smart toothbrushes. And then we got to marketing and strategy discussions, including things about, and then we got into the stuff about platforms and IT infrastructures inside of companies and between companies. And it seems to me like that's a gigantic distance from talking about organization design. And along the way, there was a comment about, well, what do we mean by digital and the digital world and all that kind of stuff? Well, actually, just a few days ago, I made a list of 100 things, 100 couplets that start with digital, like digital transformation, digital world, digital artifact, digital blah, blah, blah. And it was for a purpose in a paper I'm writing that is about a totally different topic. I'm not going to go into that topic now, but to me, there's a big problem in this discussion about people speaking very generally about things that they're thinking about sort of in their own world of experience without too many real examples. And I don't think that a Coca-Cola dispenser is a good example of organization design. It's a good example of marketing. It's a good example of something that might have come out of organization design, but I'm not sure that's what we're really talking about here. So I think that it's really important to have a lot of real examples that are not, real examples that could be put together fairly quickly, that are the kind of thing we're talking about, that are the sweet spot for this discussion.
Okay. Any other comments, particularly maybe building on what Steve had to say? Particularly about the socio-technical, I can add maybe another thought, but we'd rather hear from you first. Okay, well, I mean, we've talked about the involvement of the customer in terms of the interaction and so forth, but another thought that has come to our mind in thinking about the way the socio-technical systems perspective may have shifted is just thinking about structures, because a lot of what we do in this perspective, and it relates to organization design, Steve, is design structures of interaction and structures of processes. We try to structure those processes, but as we reflect on what we see happening in our work and particularly in situations involving the use of digital technology, these structures are extremely temporary. And they're almost to the point that we don't talk about them as structures. People, and this is again where our words can play games perhaps on us, but we move more into thinking about networks than structures, but networks are themselves forms of structures. So, but the basic notion is that structures are increasingly becoming very temporary. And that has a huge impact on relationships. It makes a difference in terms of how you design. So that's another way in which we think the socio-technical systems perspective has shifted in this new context.
Let me just give a different example,
yeah,
which I've actually used a lot of times. It's an article in the New Yorker magazine in last November by Atul Gawanda, who's a surgeon in Boston, and it's called "Why Do Doctors Hate Their Computers?" And he talks about the fact that they're spending more and more time being forced to spend time putting stuff into computers, going home at night putting stuff into computers because they don't have enough time during the day to put the stuff into the computers, spending less time with their patients. And the burnout rate among doctors is much higher among the people who use computers more. And that's exactly the opposite of the kind of situation where organizations are temporary. But I think that that's a very apt example for a lot of the things we're talking about here. Did the doctors actually have any ability to to determine how those systems work that are driving them crazy?
Well, yes, Steve. Just a response to that. Here in Sutter, and you're familiar with Palo Alto and Sutter and all of that. What they're doing is they started using taking that problem and solving it through a social technical solution. One is that they're starting to give docs Google Glasses in order to talk into the glasses, and then that gets codified. And they're also using medical students, like up in San Francisco, to capture data during the patient conversation to free up the doc. So they're not doing, particularly primary care docs, to free them up so they're not working in the evenings. The point being here is that they're looking at different social technical solutions to solve that particular burnout problem. Now, I don't think that's nationally, but I know that that's happening here. And that's a different job design, a different organizational design.
The Gowanda article said that they were using people from India who were trained doctors in India who, instead of taking care of patients, were being scribes for doctors in Boston.
Yeah,
but, yes, I agree. That's a socio-technical solution to a problem that was imposed on them by the fact that we got to do an insane amount of data collection.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think part of what you're also saying, Steve, go ahead.
Hi, you guys. I read the article as well, Steve. And I have a doctor who now she has an iPad and she took pictures for dermatology. She took pictures of whatever of spots and, kept everything on her iPad. And the last time I went, she said, I'm going to bring in the nurse. She said, I'm not doing this anymore. This has driven me to distraction. Just exactly what you're talking about and what Atul talked about. But I think it is increasing data, but that isn't really the reason. I think it's driven from the customer wanting to have portable medical records, right? So that I can go anywhere else and she can just shift this digital file. So isn't that customer driven to a large extent?
Yeah, Betsy, being in healthcare, one of the issues is that there's a real revolt right now with primary care docs all around the country around burnout.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, so that's part of the problem. Yeah.
Okay, folks. Yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of our limited time. Are there any other aspects of the socio-technical systems perspective that you would highlight? I think all the comments you've made are very useful and sort of add to the picture, but are there any other dimensions of this perspective, the heart of the value creation process?
Well, just to come back to the conversation that Paul started, but I think we're continuing, we used to think about technology as a singular entity within an organization, in a plant, it had an assembly line, or a coal mine had long wall technology, but now we're thinking about multiple technologies and they're all changing at the same time. So the idea of we're going to jointly optimize is an elusive goal. And one of the things that the participants in the STAR Lab said was that they've come to the conclusion that there is no end to this. And so the idea of a from-to design, where we're going to have a system that's not under control and we're going to create a system that is under control, technologically, as well as in terms of incorporating the social system to help make that happen, is increasingly elusive. And so we're designing for agility as well as trying to keep our eye on efficiency, and it's getting to be tough to do both in a world that's changing as fast as ours is.
Right, and we haven't talked about it, but yeah, that I think, Bill, is one of the ways in which a lot of us have experienced this and written about it in terms of how the design process, organization design process itself, the process has had to change because of the dynamics of all the systems that we're working with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I would say that another challenge, as I think we've all said before, is to be able to design social systems that are able to, in fact, develop and utilize technologies in ways that are helpful to the various stakeholders, one of which is the users, one of which is the customers, and so on. But in some ways, we are talking about a challenge of designing a social system that can make sure that the equipment, the technology, whatever kind of technology it is, digital or otherwise, that is brought in, is in fact supportive of the needs of multiple stakeholders, including the users. This does not seem like a no-brainer, except that we have lots of examples, as Steve just pointed out, where the technology is not very helpful. And we have the example that Stu made, where we said that there is choice in technology, just as there is choice in the social system.
Right.
There is choice in technology.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think Davis's advocacy of technological choice is all the more important today than even it was back in his time in the 70s and 80s. Look, we've got about 5 minutes. Carolyn, just in deference to people's time, I think maybe we should get close to wrapping up and saying definitely this is not meant to be the end of the conversation. And I think you want to have some time to speak a little bit about how we hope to incorporate these three perspectives in our meeting in September at USC.
Marcella, are you doing the next slide?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Okay. So what we are going to be doing in LA is using this framework to keep testing its value in terms of looking at the different kinds of changes that different presenters will be making, and we'll be actually working with them to understand the value. So there will be on Tuesday 2 workshops in the morning, one on healthcare in Europe, and in the afternoon on the Equitable Food Initiative, both half-day workshops to really understand. In fact, Bernard and Ezra have written a book that's behind the cases that will be presented in the healthcare one, and Ezra is going to be there to present it. The EFI one will have, Bert and I are working with our EFI colleagues, Equitable Food Initiative colleagues, to look at their work in terms of this framework. Then Star Lab Alliance on Wednesday, the main session, has their own framework and their own data to present, but we'll also be using our framework to see how the two help each other in understanding how to move ahead and make progress in this digital era. Then on Thursday, we have a case with Hyperloop Technologies, and that will be probably most likely at their site, so we'll get to see the technology that they're evolving for transportation. And then finally on Friday, we're going to have LA County, the city, and Long Beach City all talking about their collective efforts working on developing smart city for LA and the county and the other cities within it. And so we'll be looking at the challenges that particularly the CIOs are facing in dealing with the constituents that are citizens inside the government and inside their own IT department. How do they bring all these people together to a common understanding of where they're going and how to organize to do this? So this framework will be repeated several times in terms of trying to understand by looking at the socio-ecological, socio-psychological, socio-technical, and looking at all these different interventions from those perspectives. How do we leverage a design process that is most impactful and enables us to have the kind of results we're looking for? So we hope, Marcella, do you want to put the next slide up? That you will join us in LA. We thank you for your participation today. We will be putting up a Google Docs with the notes from today, and so we encourage you to add to that if you don't feel we've captured what you said today or you have more to say about this. And we also will have a follow-up survey on the actual webinar itself. And you can register for the conference at our website, and you can also get the paper that we wrote on the heritage on the website. So again, on behalf of Bert and myself, thank you very much for this interesting dialogue today.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. Thank you. Very, very stimulating. Lots of food for thought.
See you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
See some of you in September.
Yes, hopefully.